All right, we're gonna start this meeting. Good morning. This is a meeting of the Oregon Water Resources Commission. We have two agenda items today, and followed by public comment at the close of the regular agenda items. Our first agenda item is oral argument on a contested case order. So it is 8:30 on November 22nd, and I'm reopening the record in the contested case hearing for the purpose of hearing argument from the parties. So I'd like to just talk a little bit about the logistics for today. We're going to, let's see. The argument, this proceeding is being recorded, and it's part of the record for the contested case hearing. Each of the parties will have 15 minutes for argument. We won't be accepting any written material into the to the commission today, and no new evidence. The evidentiary record is closed in the hearing. Argument should be confined to the record. There won't be any opportunity for rebuttal argument. I'm going to, the commission doesn't have any kind of timing devices that helps parties know what time is happening. So I am going to try to help with that. I have a 5-minute card and a 2-minute card, which I will use to kind of help you stay on track in the 15-minute time period. So I'll do my best to track the time and hold that up. So the order that we've decided for today will be Water Watch of Oregon, who's represented by Brian Posewitz. In the contested case hearing was referred to as the Rue Protestants, represented by Janet Newman, and the East Valley Water District, represented by Kirk Mogg and Crystal Chase. So I've covered all of the early logistics. Just so, the other thing I should point out is that at the close of argument, so like 45 minutes from now, the commission will recess, and I'll talk a little bit more about the logistics of that at the close of argument. So with that, I would ask for Brian Posewitz to approach.
Okay. Good morning, Chair Reeds, members of the Commission. Thank you for the chance to talk to you this morning. My name is Brian Posewitz. I am a staff attorney at Water Watch of Oregon. Water Watch is a nonprofit organization that promotes protection and restoration of natural stream flows in Oregon. And we also have done significant work over the years to protect fish passage and to remove barriers to fish passage. We are one of the protestants in this case, one of the parties that protested the proposed issuance of the permit for the dam and reservoir on Drift Creek. We very much appreciate the work and the analysis that the subcommittee did on this. We know there was an extraordinary amount of written material, and we think you did a great job of distilling that, analyzing that, and bringing that to one of the key issues, one of the core issues in the case. We obviously support the recommendation of the subcommittee to deny the permit on grounds that issuing it would conflict with an existing water right, namely an in-stream water right that protects flows in Drift Creek for the benefit of cutthroat trout. It would conflict because it would flood a significant portion of cutthroat trout habitat that's protected by the in-stream water right. I think the record shows about 3 miles of Drift Creek and tributaries used by cutthroat trout would be flooded, and that portion of Drift Creek is protected by an in-stream water right. We think there are many other grounds for denying the application in this case. I'm largely going to just defer to our written exceptions for those additional grounds. I did just want to make a couple of key points, and just to sort of refresh on the facts here. What this application proposes to do is to put a new dam, a 70-foot dam, and a reservoir, a 12,000 acre-foot reservoir that would cover about 350 acres as the reservoir footprint, right in the middle of the stream channel of Drift Creek. And Drift Creek is a stream that is considered habitat anyway for steelhead that are threatened under the Endangered Species Act, for Chinook salmon that are threatened under the Endangered Species Act, for Pacific lamprey that are listed as a state-sensitive species, and for cutthroat trout that, as I've mentioned, are protected. They're a native species, and they're protected by an in-stream water right in Drift Creek. The record shows pretty clearly there would not be fish passage at this dam. We think this is contrary to the significant public policy direction in Oregon to remove dams and restore fish passage, to not put new barriers to fish passage in our fish-bearing streams. The record, among the items in the record on that point, was that the state of Oregon spends about $10 million a year trying to take fish passage barriers out of the stream, and this application would put a new one in the stream. And as I've noted, this would be inconsistent with the in-stream water right that protects Drift Creek as cutthroat trout habitat. There are conditions in the proposed permit that supposedly would make up for some of these impacts. Those conditions rely largely on unknown future plans that we were not in a position to judge or evaluate or contest. And even if those unknown future plans turned out perfectly, they still would not mitigate all of the impacts of this project, including the impacts of simply flooding 3 miles of Drift Creek with a reservoir. We think the record also shows that there is not a compelling need for this water, that it would be used primarily as a backup source of water for farms that already have water rights and are largely able to farm all of their existing acreage. It's was mostly supported as a backup source for a speculative fear of future regulation that could reduce some of those water supplies. And we also think that to the extent there is a compelling need for more water in this area for these users, that there are better alternatives to get at with far fewer impacts on the environment and on private property rights. And one of the ones we highlighted was the water stored in existing Army Corps of Engineers reservoirs, some of which is still available for irrigation contracts. With respect to the specific grounds that the subcommittee found for denying the permit in this case, I just want to say that although we use slightly different language, we came at this issue from the standpoint of calling it an injury to the in-stream water right, because it would conflict with the beneficial use protected by the in-stream water right. Even though we argued the issue under that heading, injury, we think we've consistently argued the point that the subcommittee is relying on throughout this case, and in particular, just going all the way back to our protest in 2014, we wrote, an in-stream water right exists for Drift Creek. The reservoir will inundate part of the creek, thus the flow right will not be utilized as protected under the law. We think that's basically what the subcommittee is saying. We've also raised that issue at every step in the proceeding, and in our closing brief, we even raised that issue under the specific public interest factor that is cited in the subcommittee's recommendation as the public interest factor that justifies denial of the permit in this case. Finally, I just want to say that I think you're probably going to hear about all of the time and money that's been invested in planning and promoting this project. I would just say in response to that we have invested a significant amount of time and money in opposing this project, and that the other protestants have done so as well. And I think it was clear from the very beginning that this was a project that was going to be very controversial, both from an environmental standpoint and from a property rights standpoint, and that there was from the very beginning, there was a clear possibility that this permit might not be granted. And with those comments, I will conclude. Thank you.
Thank you. Didn't have to hold up any any reminders. Janet Newman for the Rue protestants.
Good morning, Chair Reeves and Commission members. Thank you for the opportunity to speak. I will hopefully be as brief as Mr. Posowitz was. I'm Janet Newman. I represent a group of farmers known as, in this proceeding, as the Rue Protestants. The Rue Protestants own the farmland where the East Valley Water District is proposing to locate the dam and reservoir in their proposed Drift Creek project. They are not members of the district. The sites of their farms are 10 to 12 miles outside the boundaries of the irrigation district. They are dryland farmers, and they grow many of the same crops as some of the members of the East Valley Water District and compete in the same marketplace for those crops. I also want to just echo my thanks for both the subcommittee and the commission and the department and the DOJ for dealing with this very large record and contentious case. I know it's been a lot of effort for many, many people, and I appreciate that. My group of clients, the Rue Protestants, supports the subcommittee's recommendation. As the subcommittee report noted in footnote 21, both my clients and Water Watch raised this issue from the beginning of the impact to the in-stream water right by damming up approximately 3 miles of the Drift Creek as a key issue. And I want to endorse Mr. Pozowitz's comments in every regard to that effect. I just want to add a couple things on that particular issue and then mention just a few other points. Drift Creek is the last major undammed tributary of the Pudding River. And other blockages, the Pudding River Watershed Council and others, this is all reflected in the record, are working on eliminating the blockages to fish passage in the other tributaries. So one issue is whether it makes any sense whatsoever to put a new on-channel stream blocking dam in the last major undammed tributary while spending public funds and efforts on taking some of the other ones out. And Mr. Posowitz gave you some monetary significance to that point as well. And I just wanted to mention that in addition to cutthroat habitat for which the in-stream right was designated, there's also considerable habitat in this creek for other species. Mr. Posowitz mentioned some of those. I also wanted to mention Pacific lamprey, which is also a listed species, is found in Drift Creek. There was considerable evidence presented in the contested case of the impact to these various fisheries and habitat in Drift Creek by this project. Now I want to just shift gears for just a moment and talk about my clients specifically. And I recognize that this is not the key focus of the subcommittee recommendation, which I'm totally in support of, but I just want to mention that we did present significant argument and evidence on other ways in which we believe that the proposed project conflicts with the public interest standards in the statute, including, and I want to mention that we've mentioned very many of we've raised something under each of the 7 public interest factors listed in ORS 537.170(8), but we concentrated on a couple of those, factors B and E, and we believe we presented significant evidence that this project is uneconomic, wasteful, and unreasonable under the public interest factors listed in those statutory provisions, partly because it inundates the land of competing farmers who are dry land farmers, would not benefit in any way from this project, and are 10 miles outside the district and have absolutely no say in the governance or decisions of the irrigation district, because that is a quasi-public entity that is run by a board elected from its own members, and yet is then authorized or empowered significantly by statute with governmental powers, including the power of eminent domain and condemnation. So the issuance of this water right results in East Valley Water District having the statutory authority to force my group of farmers who are not willing sellers to give up some of their productive farmland so that their competitors can improve and enhance the economic benefit of their farms with the irrigation water. And we had significant emotional testimony in the contested case hearing on both sides of the fact that we're talking about fourth-generation farmers on both sides of this issue, and it is unreasonable to enable one group to eliminate some of the land, productive land of the other group, and that's because of the unique power of an irrigation district. And we believe it is not in the public interest to allow that sort of project to occur, in addition to the significant environmental impacts and the particular impact on the in-stream water right. And I should add one last thing. There is a house also involved in the area that would be condemned, a very old farmhouse that's right in the middle of where the reservoir site is, that is occupied by a family that's lived there for many, many years. And with that, I will close. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Newman. Next, Kirk Mogg and Crystal Chase. Morning.
Good morning, Chair Reeves, Commissioners. On behalf of East Valley Water District, Kirk Mogg, and with me, my colleague Crystal Chase. East Valley urges the Commission to deny protestants' exceptions and adopt the Director's final order without modification. The subcommittee recommends that you reverse the Director's final order, but to do so would be inconsistent with applicable law and dramatically alter the standard for obtaining a new water right. The subcommittee's recommendation is inconsistent with the proposed final order issued by the department's professional staff, the independent findings and recommendations of the administrative law judge, and the director's final order, all without reasoned explanation. The subcommittee, in its recommendation, announced a new public interest standard that would govern the department's review of every water right application going forward. Not just storage applications, every water right application going forward. If adopted by the Commission, this newly announced standard will have far-reaching and unintended consequences. The new standard would prohibit the department from granting any new on-channel permits on streams with in-stream water rights, even though the legislature has recognized storage as a beneficial use, and even though storage is permissible under a number of basin plans. This is beyond the Commission's authority. The new standard would also significantly expand the scope of rights evidenced by an in-stream water right. Under existing law, a water right entitles the holder to a particular rate or volume of water. Yet, the subcommittee's recommendation suggests that the holder of an in-stream water right has the right not only to a particular rate or volume of water, but also to preserve a particular characteristic of the water body, here the characteristic of a natural stream channel. Such a right has never before been recognized in Oregon and is inconsistent with existing law. If the Commission embraces this new standard, we can expect that in future protests, Water Watch and similarly situated protests will argue that in-stream water rights also entitle the holder to a particular water quality, temperature, or, as you already heard from Mr. Pozowitz this morning, a habitat protection function. This is a dangerous precedent to set. But today, the impacts of the Commission's decision are far less remote. If the commission adopts the subcommittee's recommendation, more than 60 years of work by multiple generations of East Valley farmers will be for naught. These farmers, several of whom are here with us today, have invested more than $1 million of their own money to secure a sustainable irrigation future for this area. Another $1 million of public funds have supported the development of an alternative water supply, storage, to support irrigation within East Valley's boundary. Although the Rue protestants argue that only a small group of farmers would benefit from East Valley's effort, the record tells a markedly different story. The director's final order found that the Willamette Valley, Marion County, and the state of Oregon will benefit economically from the East Valley Water District farmers having a reliable water supply. So why have East Valley farmers spent decades exploring a new water storage project? Surface water sources in East Valley are over-appropriated during the irrigation season, and groundwater levels are declining. Rather than bury their heads in the sand, East Valley farmers have banded together in an effort to secure a sustainable water future. East Valley evaluated many potential storage options and ultimately selected the Drift Creek site. The department, the commission, and the legislature have all played a role in supporting East Valley's efforts. Phil Ward, former director of the department, testified during this contested case hearing that he believed during his tenure as director that East Valley farmers needed another water source to support existing agriculture and future crops. Director Ward testified that the proposed reservoir would provide a secure source of water for future agricultural producers in the area. East Valley's application has been approved at every stage in the process. The department's professional staff reviewed the application, determined that it complied with all applicable requirements, and issued a proposed final order to approve the application. Testimony from current and former department staff confirmed that East Valley's application included all of the information required under applicable law. To treat this application differently would be to treat East Valley differently from every other water right applicant. It is abundantly clear at this point that the subcommittee's recommendation to reverse the director's final order hinges on a single public interest factor in ORS 537-170, subsection 8. Well, I'll refer to that as public interest factor F. The subcommittee incorrectly interprets this factor, and if the commission adopts this recommendation, the commission will commit reversible error and the decision will not withstand scrutiny on judicial review for several reasons. Each of these reasons provides an independent basis to affirm the director's final order in full. First, the subcommittee recommends denying East Valley's storage application based on a single public interest factor. This is reversible error because the public interest factors must be considered together as a whole. This means that a protestant must demonstrate that issuance of the permit will impair or be detrimental to the public interest after considering all of the public interest factors. That is, a protestant cannot meet its burden simply by showing that a single public interest factor tips in the protestant's favor. Rather, this is a totality of the circumstances test where all factors must be considered and no one factor is dispositive. By relying on a single factor to determine that the public interest is impaired, the commission would commit reversible error. Second, at no point during this process did the department take the position that the proposed use would impair or be detrimental to the public interest. In the original proposed final order, the department concluded that public interest factor F would not be impaired, explaining that, quote, all vested water rights are protected by their respective priority dates, the prior appropriation system, and the department's regulatory procedures. And in the department's responsive closing memorandum on page 8, the department explained that, quote, measuring flows at the lower end of the reach, that is, at the mouth of Drift Creek, will ensure that flows throughout the reach are protected. In other words, the department has already concluded that the proposed use, as conditioned in the director's final order, will protect the vested rights evidenced by the in-stream water right. The subcommittee's recommendation cannot be reconciled with that finding, nor does it explain the rationale for announcing a new interpretation of public interest factor F after the evidentiary record in this case closed. Indeed, the recommendation misinterprets public interest factor F. That factor requires consideration of vested rights and, quote, the means necessary to protect such rights. As the Oregon Court of Appeals recognized in Benz versus Water Commission, the Commission adequately considers this factor when it relies on the protections provided by Oregon's prior appropriation system for senior rights. And here, the Director's final order further provides additional means necessary to protect the in-stream water right, including measurement and bypass conditions. The subcommittee's recommendation errs in concluding that public interest factor F requires more. The subcommittee erroneously imports two other statutes, ORS 537-120 and 537-160, into the public interest analysis. But those two statutes, which require that a new water right not impair or conflict with an existing right, simply codify the basic principle of prior appropriation, nothing more. The subcommittee's recommendation is also inconsistent with basic and long-standing principles of Oregon water law. Pursuant to ORS 537-350, an in-stream water right shall have the same legal status as any other water right for which a certificate has been issued. Vested water rights entitle a holder to a particular rate or volume of water. In-stream water rights are the same. They merely entitle the holder to have a certain rate or volume of water left in the stream. Yet the subcommittee's recommendation, if adopted by the Commission today, would dramatically expand the scope of rights reflected in an in-stream water right. For example, the recommendation suggests that the in-stream water right here protects particular stream conditions and remarkably suggests that the vested right requires protection of a natural stream channel. That is not the law in Oregon. Ms. Newman and Mr. Posowitz reference potential impacts to other species, but as conditioned in the final order, these impacts would be mitigated. Third, the Commission should not adopt the subcommittee's recommendation because it would impermissibly shift the burden to East Valley to prove an absence of detriment to the public interest. As the Director's final order reflects, protestants have the burden of proving detriment to the public interest by a preponderance of the evidence. The Director found, as a factual matter, that the Department determined in 2013 that East Valley's application contained, quote, all required information and was, quote, complete. Nonetheless, the subcommittee suggests the application provides insufficient information about the intended construction or operation of the reservoir, the place of use, or details about fish passage. The subcommittee concludes that as a result of that alleged lack of information, the application must be denied. That recommendation is inconsistent with applicable law and the application that East Valley was required to submit. As Dwight French and Adam Sussman both testified, no other information was required, and to require additional information would have been to treat East Valley differently from all other water right applicants. The recommendation is also inconsistent with the applicable burden of proof. It was protestants' obligation to present evidence that the proposed use as approved in the proposed final order fails to protect vested rights. And to the extent there is uncertainty about the impacts of the proposed use on the in-stream water right, that uncertainty does not justify denial of a complete application. To do so would be to impose additional requirements on East Valley's application that are not required by law. Fourth, the findings of fact in the Department's final order do not support the subcommittee's recommendation, and substantial evidence in the record does not exist to allow the Commission to make the findings necessary to support its recommendation. The subcommittee concludes that the in-stream water right will be, quote, frustrated if the proposed use is allowed because the in-stream water right protects the variability of flow within the natural stream channel. The subcommittee offers no citation to the factual record to support that finding. The Commission should reject the findings for three separate and independent reasons. The subcommittee's recommendation erroneously assumes that the in-stream water right currently supports the different life stages of cutthroat trout. That is contrary to the factual findings in the Director's final order. In paragraphs 257 and 259, the ALJ and the Director found that Drift Creek's temperature from mid-June to September is too warm for trout rearing and migration. Pursuant to ORS 183-560, subparagraph 3, the Commission cannot modify the finding of historical fact unless clear and convincing evidence in the record supports the conclusion that the finding is wrong. No such clear and convincing evidence exists here. The findings in the Director's final order do not support the conclusion that the purpose of the in-stream water right would be frustrated by the proposed use. The subcommittee's recommendation erroneously assumes that the in-stream water right requires variability of flow. That isn't correct. The in-stream water right, by its terms, merely sets a minimum flow on a monthly basis. Although those minimums differ by month, the in-stream water right does not set a maximum flow and thereby does not guarantee variability of flow. The subcommittee's proposed findings that the proposed use would harm cutthroat trout is not supported by substantial evidence in the record. Instead, the testimony offered at the contested case hearing by biologist Lucius Caldwell and fisheries scientist David DeCray supports the opposite conclusion. Dr. Caldwell testified that the current limiting factor for cutthroat trout in Drift Creek is a bottleneck in rearing capacity. He further testified that because the proposed reservoir would release additional water above live flows in the summer, it has the potential to decrease water temperature below the reservoir in the late summer, thereby mitigating the primary factor limiting rearing capacity. David DeCray's testimony also supports the conclusion that the reservoir could improve habitat for cutthroat trout on Drift Creek. Fifth, the Commission should decline to adopt the subcommittee's recommendation because the Commission lacks authority to modify the Director's final order unless it is allowing specific exceptions. You heard from Ms. Newman and Mr. Posowitz that the subcommittee is adopting an argument that they made, but that isn't the case. The subcommittee's recommendation is creating a new standard that was not advanced by the parties and could not have been because the law up until this point in Oregon is not consistent with the standard articulated in the subcommittee's recommendation. Were the Commission to adopt the novel interpretation of public interest factor F that the subcommittee proposed this week, after the close of evidence and only days before this hearing, the Commission would not be allowing an exception from protestants. Rather, the Commission would be second-guessing the Director's final order based on its own newly minted interpretation of law. This is outside the range of discretion delegated to the Commission by the legislature. In closing, East Valley urges the Commission to take a different approach than that articulated by the subcommittee, because that approach is fundamentally flawed both procedurally and substantively. Instead, the Commission should deny the exceptions and adopt the Director's final order in full. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Mogg. Ms. Chase? So at this point, the Commission is going to recess. And pursuant to, I'm just going to read this script to get it onto the record. Pursuant to ORS 192.690 sub 1, the public meetings law does not apply to deliberation of state agencies in contested case hearings under ORS Chapter 183. The Commission is now recessing the public meeting so that it may deliberate on the recommendations of the subcommittee and the exceptions filed to the Director's final order in this case. The Commission will deliberate and will then reconvene the public meeting to vote on whether to issue a modified order or deny the exceptions and affirm the final order. We'll be in deliberations for 1 hour, roughly, and we'll reconvene at 10. Might be a little bit later than that, I suppose. We're scheduled, the next agenda item is scheduled at 10:15. We'll definitely return by then. It's now 9 o'clock, and we're going to go off the record, and we'll resume soon. Thank you. Okay, we're going to reconvene our meeting. Thank you for your patience, everyone. I know we took longer than an hour, but we had the opportunity, and so we used it. But so we're back on the record in the contested case hearing for the purpose of taking a vote on the final order. It is 10:15, and it's November 22nd. Before we vote, are there any comments, observations that commissioners wish to make? None. All right, can I get a motion?
Chair Reeves, I move that the Commission adopt the recommendations of the subcommittee and issue a final order that is consistent with the recommendations of the subcommittees provided in attachment A of the staff report for agenda item J.
In a second?
I second the motion.
All right, it's been moved and seconded to accept the subcommittee's recommendation and issue a final order consistent with that recommendation. Any further discussion? Commissioner Kahara?
I vote yes to affirm.
Commissioner Mall?
Yes.
Commissioner Corn?
Yes. Yes. Yes.
Baumgartner? And yes, Commission is unanimous in voting to affirm the subcommittee's recommendation and issue a final order consistent with that recommendation. And I'm going to close this record on before I do that, we anticipate a final order going to the parties this coming week. So with that, I'm going to close the record and we'll move to the next agenda item. We do have public comment available at the end of this commission meeting. And although if there are people who want to speak to us about this agenda item, that's permissible during the public comment period, just understand that it is not, will not be part of this, the commission's decision record, and won't be part of the record, won't go into this decision, will not affect the decision. So, thank you. Next item is an overview of the process for state recognition of place-based integrated water resources plans. We're a little bit early on this item, but I think the participants are here. Is that right? Yep. Steve?
Chair Reeves, I am waiting for my colleague Harmony. She should be here momentarily.
Okay, great, thank you. Thanks. Steve and Harmony, welcome.
Thank you.
Are we okay with this early start time in terms of the participants in the conversation today?
Chair
We're
Reeves,
10 minutes
will let
early.
everyone present.
Okay, great.
Good morning. Sorry for the lateness and the out-of-breathness. I was doing some grant application reviews today, and I'm helping out with that. For the record, my name is Harmony Burright. I'm a planning coordinator with the Water Resources Department, obviously.
And I'm Steve Perret, also a planning coordinator with the Water Resource Department.
And today, we're going to kind of walk you through just some background, but the real focus of what we want to talk with you about today is the process for recognizing state recognition of the place-based integrated water resources plans. So for your benefit and for everyone's benefit, we're going to just do a background of place-based planning, kind of get us up to speed to where we are in current day. We're going to give you some highlights, some real high-level highlights of 2019 and a preview of what's to come in 2020. And then I'm going to hand it off to Steve. He's going to talk to you about the development of Step 5 guidance and kind of walk you through what that process will look like, or at least what we're proposing. And then we'd love to hear some feedback from you, get some questions from you, and then we'll invite folks from our places to come up and address you directly. So, as a reminder, place-based planning is a part of the Water Resources Development Program. We're here to provide resources and tools to help Oregonians meet their in-stream and out-of-stream needs. Place-based planning originally generated as recommended action from the Integrated Water Resources Strategy, recognizing that integration is most likely to happen kind of on the ground, and that we can use on-the-ground actions to make progress towards statewide priorities. It was also recognized again in the 2017, the update to the Integrated Water Resource Strategy. Our predecessors developed a set of draft guidelines and put forward these draft guidelines to be tested in partnership with the state by several places. and it was authorized in 2015 by Senate Bill 266, which provided our authority to make grants, and that was extended most recently. We'll talk about that briefly, but that was extended until 2023 when that authority expires or sunsets. 5 planning steps. Hopefully you all should know them very well by now. You start with building a collaborative and inclusive process. Step 2 and 3 are really about information gathering and sense making. So understanding your current conditions and then understanding your current and future needs, identifying integrated solutions, then pulling that all together in a plan that is adopted locally and then also brought before the state for state recognition. So just a quick overview, there's a handout in your packets of the current status of the places. The Upper Mid-Coast is working on Step 3 and anticipates transitioning to Step 4 sometime in early to mid next year. Lower John Day is finishing up Step 3, and Hannah will be able to speak with you about that today, but I think they're either in the middle of a public comment period for their Step 3 report, or they maybe just finished it up, and they're starting to explore integrated solutions. Upper Grand Ronde, they've kind of been leading the charge from the beginning, and they're pulling together. I think they started with 100 different strategies and solutions, and they're trying to figure out how to sort and bin those, and then how to vet and gain consensus on them. Harney Basin has been kind of working on steps 2, 3, and 4 concurrently. And at this point, they're really focused on groundwater solutions and strategies, and will turn their attention to surface water strategies once they've gained consensus around some of the groundwater solutions due to some of the urgency around groundwater declines in that basin. So as I mentioned, in 2019, House Bill 2084 extended the sunset of the program to 2023. You may recall that the legislature gave us 4 years to distribute funding and to test this program, which if you've been a part of a multi-stakeholder collaborative, you know how short a period of time that is. So we're grateful to have a little bit more time and to give our places more time, because that's something that we heard from them, is that we need more time and more support to get this work done. A lot of them are engaging partners that they've never maybe engaged before. We also received an additional $550,000. Bulk of that is going to the places to support both development of the plan as well as helping the groups stay together, stay cohesive as they transition to implementation. And then we're going to use a part of that funding to evaluate this approach. We are really excited about a place-based learning partnership that we've created with Ford Family Foundation. This was an outgrowth of an earlier relationship we had with the Oregon Community Foundation that helped bring the 4 places to learn from each other together in Bend. And the Ford Family Foundation has kind of allowed us to take that to the next level, and all of the 4 places were actually able to go and visit each other's places, observe each other's processes, meet each other's partners, and learn at a deeper level kind of what makes each place different, but then also really exploring kind of what they have in common. All of the state agencies have been working to deliver technical assistance and have been participating as partners. We've developed this Planning Step 5 guidance, and now, as you recall, you had the guidelines, which are kind of the broad set of what place-based planning is. The guidance really gets into more specifics around the how. How do you do Step 5? And then we'll invite some folks up from the planning groups to give you some updates and highlights from their efforts. These are some just pictures of what happened this year. So you can see in the upper left-hand corner, that's one of our recent meetings with the Mid-Coast Water Planning Partnership that was hosted by the Confederated Tribes of the Siletz Indians. We were with opening remarks from Vice Chair Bud Lane. We also had Oregon's Kitchen Table there, which had recently conducted a survey of knowledge, values, and beliefs in the Mid-Coast around water. And at this particular meeting, we heard from ODFW on their statewide efforts to better understand in-stream flows. We heard from the tribes. We heard from the Watershed Council on their Coho business planning effort. and DEQ on their TMDL effort. So lots of information around in-stream stuff. And then you've got the Harney group. They several months ago made a trip out to Salem and met with Director Byler, Director Lofsgarden, and others to talk about their planning process and to talk about the need for a groundwater CREP, which I won't get into in too much detail. Perhaps Rhiann from Harney will get into it. But they have built consensus around a number of solutions and then are trying to bring the state along in developing a technical, an interagency technical team to kind of shepherd that. And then on the bottom, we've got pictures of the learning partnership. So we were able to go out to John Day and experience the beauty and splendor of Cottonwood Creek Canyon. Is that right? Cottonwood Canyon. They did an outreach event to rafters there. So we had dinner, and the other places got to, see what the Lower John Day is all about. It's a really beautiful area. It was my first time there. And then on the other side, you see you can see several folks from the places. You can see several agency folks and someone from Ford Family at one of our last learning partnership sessions in Newport, where we actually, the places invited leadership from the core IWRS agencies to kind of engage in some conversations. In 2020, we anticipate that Upper Grand Ronde will be the first ones to finish a plan. We're all very, very eager and excited about this. We're anticipating that sometime in summer and fall. That's one reason why we wanted to come before you today, is to kind of prepare you for that and talk through what that might look like. The second plan we anticipate in winter from the Lower John Day. They're both kind of grappling with step 4 and the complexity of building integrated solutions with diverse partners. And then at the same time, we at the state level are going to be evaluating the pilot phase, kind of learning about what worked and what didn't, the impact that we've had and how we could stand to improve. We're also going to be taking a broader look around the state to understand, as we shape the future of this program, what do Oregonians need and how are we making sure that we're creating something that people need. So going back to the guidelines, as you recall, this is like the high-level summary of what happens. And the Step 5 guidelines give us, I think, about 4 paragraphs about what Step 5 means. And within that, we're just going to throw some quotes up on you, and they're going to be verbatim. Because the guidelines are really kind of our guiding star. We were, hired to test the guidelines with these places, and so that's what we really used to orient ourselves. But then we did the work to kind of build some how and some specificity around what. So the 2 key elements in Step 5 in terms of state recognition are the IWRS project team agencies, this interagency review process of the draft final or near final plans. And then also the Commission's role in recognizing those plans. So the Commission will ultimately make the final decision about whether to formally accept a place-based plan as a component of the IWRS, and the Commission will decide whether the plan adheres to the draft place-based planning guidelines and statewide goals of meeting in-stream and out-of-stream water needs. So we wanted to make you aware of your role, and then also kind of talk about what happens before things reach you, and then what kind of we're thinking in terms of your engagement at the state recognition, at the point of state recognition.
Okay, so a little bit more specific about how the Step 5 guidance was developed. And we took, I think, a collaborative approach to this so that it wasn't just a Water Resources Department product. We wanted to include the state agencies that will be involved in reviewing, and we wanted to include the planning groups that will be, their plans will be reviewed. So we took a collaborative approach and had input from those folks along the way, as well as additional technical staff from within the department. So a lot of people have put effort and thought into this guidance, and it still is a draft guidance. And I want to thank those folks for that effort that they put in. Some of them are here today, so thank you very much. We started that at the tail end of last year, so it's been nearly a one-year process to get here in front of you to describe it, but we distributed it as a draft in September for everyone to look at, and that is an attachment to the staff report. And so we're here before you today to seek your input after you've had a chance to review the guidance and review the staff report and see how does your role feel to you, and will this make sense? So this is sort of the high-level organization of the guidance. These are the parts with several appendices, and we're going to talk just a little bit more about those that are highlighted in green. So the purpose and value of a plan, the plan really is a communication tool that will describe all the hard work that the groups have put in, the condition of the water resources and needs for water resources in their area, what issues they discovered along that discovery phase, and then how they want to go about tackling those issues with different strategies and solutions. Who is part of their process, who is signed on to help them, both in terms of producing the plan, but also in implementing the plan. And like I say, what strategies, what data gaps they discovered that would be important for the state to be aware of, and that they maybe need help filling. And then also what resources they're going to need financially to implement these plans over time. So that's what a plan will accomplish. And so within the Planning Step 5 guidance, we did include some required plan contents, and this is the list of those. We really wanted each of the plans to have an executive summary that could be a smaller piece that would be a good communication tool or good for commissioners and other people to review that maybe won't have the time to review a lengthy plan. So you can see here what the required plan contents are. Finishing with a plan implementation strategy at the end. This diagram here sort of shows the evolution of a plan, and it's really focused on the state agency review and commission review aspect. After we developed this slide, I realized that developing the plan is just one box, but that's really, the first box is really where the bulk of the work happens, so I don't want to dismiss that as just being one box among six. That's where the work happens, is in that first box. Then a draft final plan that's approved by consensus of the local planning group will be brought for agency review. And then the agencies will provide feedback to the planning group. Either the plan is great as is and will recommend it, or maybe it needs some modifications to be recommended to the commission. Then the planning group would have a chance to make modifications and have it adopted locally as their final plan. So it is a final plan that will be coming before the commission for your consideration of recognition. And then, implementation of the plan will happen after that, or probably may get started before that, actually, in some cases. The state agency review, we just want to sort of point out what is the purpose of that in clear terms here. It's really to provide constructive feedback to the planning group in regards to the draft plan that was submitted, and then ultimately make a recommendation to the commission about whether that state agency review team feels that the plan should be recognized by the state. So you'll be getting a recommendation from us. That will include the core team, IWS core team agencies, ODFW, DEQ, ODA, and also OWEB. We would like to include OWEB in that review, and possibly others, depending upon the plan. We may see the need to include Oregon Health Authority or some other specialized agency on a certain aspect of the plan. And the review will be done using the criteria that's in the Step 5 guidance. So there's criteria in there that we'll be using to do that review, and then there's worksheets in terms of reporting each agency's review of the plan. I just want to go back here for a second. One important thing we heard from the planning groups when we put the draft Step 5 guidance out for their input was that they didn't want the plan to just be reviewed by statewide or policy people in the headquarters offices of those agencies. They really wanted it to be a team effort between that person and the local field person who's most familiar with their planning process. And so the Step 5 guidance does describe that that's how the review teams will be constituted. Well, the criteria in the Step 5 guidance is pretty specific about very specific things that the review team will be looking at. These are sort of the high-level questions that we'll be trying to answer as a review team. Did the planning group follow the guidelines and the planning principles? Does the plan include those required plan contents that I just showed a few minutes ago? Does the plan make sense? And should the commission then recognize the plan? So those are the big questions that we'll be trying to answer. And ultimately make a recommendation to the commission regarding state recognition. These are the things we think that the commission is likely to consider. Your review of the plan or the executive summary of the plan. We anticipate that the planning groups will each want to present to you their plan and talk about their process and how they got where they did in terms of the plan, who all was involved, et cetera. So a presentation by the planning groups. Then the recommendation from the agency review team, letters of support that might accompany the plan, and public comments that you would receive at that meeting when you consider the plan. So we see these as the potential outcomes of a commission consideration. Yes to the plan and that you'd like to recognize it, or perhaps you might have modifications that you'd like to see before you recognize it. But again, I'll reemphasize that it is a final plan that's coming before you. Or let's say a remote possibility is that you say, no, we can't recognize that plan. It doesn't meet the objectives of the program. The Planning Step 5 guidance suggests that your recognition would be memorialized in a formal way as a motion and a signed resolution that then the planning group could accompany with their plan as they take it to other funders, et cetera, so it would have that. And state-recognized plans we anticipate will be incorporated in some fashion into updates to the statewide IWS. We haven't really figured out exactly what that would look like, but it could be a number of things. It could be that the recommended actions from those place-based plans are incorporated as an appendix. It could be that the executive summaries are incorporated as an appendix. It could be a number of ways that we do that. But certainly it'll inform that update to the IWS. Do you have any questions for us or any comments about the process in your review of the guidance or staff report?
We would really love them.
It's really exciting that we're getting near the end of the initial process, but I think it's really important to emphasize it is the initial process. It's what you do with the plans after you get them that they just can't be put on the shelf. But then the recognition is a benchmark. The next step is funding, prioritization of projects and then making some of these happen. And that's when the real results come. You have the plan and the real results come when you start implementing projects and procedures and new practices and seeking out new opportunities to benefit the communities. And these have been models. I mean, it's been so exciting to see the progress of this from the beginning. When Bob and I were just on the commission, it was really when this concept was being talked about till now. But the really exciting time is the future of how this is going to really work to benefit those areas and then ultimately the state as a whole. So there's more to come, but it's going to be dependent upon these, all of you out in the audience and all the constituents back home to keep it going, the next step, to keep the momentum going that's going now.
Yeah, Steve and I were talking yesterday, and we're recognizing that, state recognition is not the end. It's just kind of memorializing that relationship between the state and the place in terms of carrying forward that vision. So we completely agree. And then what that relationship looks like going forward, we still have to, work through.
Yes, Bob.
And like Bruce, I want to commend you guys on your efforts. I think this is a great opportunity for Oregon. And as you think about how well you've proceeded in that retrospective, can you give us any guidance on what you think we should have done differently or we could have done differently to be more effective?
You have so many thoughts.
Chair Reeves and... That's good and bad. It's good to have thoughts. Chair Reeves, Commissioner Baumgartner. We have a lot of thoughts about that, but we will go through a thoughtful evaluation process, so it won't be just our thoughts, it'll be the thoughts of a wide variety of folks. But one thing that comes to mind is, I think, on the front end, we could have been better prepared. And I also think the planning groups we could have helped prepare the planning group some as well. So an orientation at the beginning, I think, would have been good with all four groups, and getting together with our state agency partners and really starting in a little bit more deliberate in that regard. And I think all four planning groups have seen some data gaps, and that they've struggled to fill, and that we have struggled to help them fill. So that's another area for sure that we would like to improve on.
If I could add to Steve's comment, it's one of the unfortunate consequences that there was a real sense of urgency for us to get moving on this program, and I think it did have some impacts that Steve was describing, which is unfortunate, but we had a 4-year sunset on the initial legislation, so there was a real need for us to get moving, and I think that in retrospect, I think Steve's point is good, that there could have been a lot more deliberate upfront work, but we really felt a time crunch at the beginning of the program.
Yeah, and that's, I think we've experienced a lot of challenges as a result of that. I think the flip side of that is that the program really has been built step by step with local partners. We didn't have the benefit of kind of, thinking to ourselves exactly how we were going to roll it out, which they experienced, the benefits and the drawbacks of that. But there are certainly things that I think, especially with respect to technical assistance, that we're still seeing that we need to invest there. I don't think that over the course of the planning we've filled that gap, and I think that's across state agencies. Oregon Department of Agriculture has one water quantity person for their entire department. They have their water quality specialists as well, and they've been very involved. DEQ, right now they have one integrated water resource strategy person, but those positions are kind of constantly in flux, so there's not that dependency there. And ODFW has not received to date a position dedicated to place-based planning. So I think we experience kind of that lack of capacity at the state level, and I know certainly the places do as well.
I actually had a question kind of related to that about the review process that the planning groups will go through, and whether the agencies, are any agencies that are going to review this going to be coming to it cold, or do they all have some familiarity and having had some input along the way?
Yeah, Chair Reeves, great question. the agencies that will be reviewing it have all been involved to some extent, a little bit, different in different places. As we talked about the Step 5 guidance with the planning groups in the spring of this year, that was something that they emphasized to us, was they would like to see the state agencies be more involved and more closely involved, especially as they get closer to Step 4 and Step 5, and the solutions or strategies start to be incorporated into their plans. And I'm glad to say I think that those state agencies have taken that to heart and have really been a big help, and are trying to work closer with the groups and with their local staff to make sure everybody's on board as we move forward.
And with the learning partnership, the conveners, like I mentioned at the last meeting in Newport, the conveners invited state agency leadership along with the staff who have been supporting these efforts to that meeting for some kind of FaceTime so they could get to know each other, ask some questions with respect to plan development and implementation. And then Steve has also been working with our partners at the core agencies to come before the boards and commissions to kind of provide an update. So he worked with Roxy, with DEQ. They were out in
We were in Enterprise, yeah.
And then in December, working with Margaret, they're going to be out in Astoria. So now we need to work with OWRD or ODFW and OWEB. But we're trying to figure out how to get the state ready for these plans.
That's good to be starting. Well, you're in the middle of it, but it's very exciting that the groups are getting close to the final product, so glad to hear that. Any other, Kathy, did you have a comment?
I'm just amazed and thrilled at how well you've been able to get all the parties together, and I'm looking forward to actually seeing the final plan to read through and see what all you guys have come up with. I mean, to me, that's exciting. And then hoping that we see those projects coming through in our grants programs and all of that. I think that's going to be really, really fun.
So those of you that aren't as familiar with a grant application process may not be aware that letters of support, there's about a 30-second window in the last week before submission where you call around and say, hey, you got that letter of support for me, Tom? And you usually provide some suggested language, and people then modify it a little bit and expect that we'll see something similar. I hope we don't, and I'd like to encourage the groups to think about something that we talked to the commission about yesterday, that very exciting, and coming out of a situation in not only these 4 places, but I mean, there's no question that around the state we're coming at these problems from a position of, wow, we've got real challenges around water. And so it's, how do we deal with this? How do we deal with this? And I've attended Midcoast meetings, and things are very problem-focused, solutions-oriented. And one of the things that we were thinking about yesterday is how can we bring in the values piece of things? How can we bring in humanity's perspective on this? How can these communities represent what's important to them? Not that we solve this water crisis, but what does it mean? And I wonder if there are ways over the course of the next year that you could encourage, and I'd love to hear during the group presentations examples of, how is this being integrated in the schools? Do the schools represent what's important? Do the kids get a chance to do that? What sort of, the Oregon Arts Commission is also working with the Ford Family Foundation on representing the landscapes of Oregon in art and humanities. What kind of, Bruce got Snoop Dogg to come to Ontario. Really? Not real. Really. Seriously. Snoop Dogg came to Ontario for a festival. Maybe we don't all have to go to that extent, but my point is that, in the same way that at a time when we're wealthier than we've ever been in some ways, we're also very unhappy people. So how can we color this plan? Because I do think that a solutions-oriented plan that we have lots of run the risk of what Commissioner Korn described. It's like, okay, here it is. But if something that speaks from the values of the people of Oregon, it just keeps it more alive. So I want to encourage you to do that and let us know how we can help with that.
Yeah, I really appreciate you raising that. I think one thing that we've heard in the Learning Partnership is, do you remember how, well, some of you weren't here, but we fully funded 2, and we partially funded, we provided catalyst funds for 2. We were going to test that out as a model for funding. And the 2 that we fully funded approached this as a more traditional grant process and a traditional plan writing process. And, you know, are very dedicated to the project and the scope of work and the budget. And the other 2 were just approached this totally differently. They were like, you know, trying to like build enough momentum to keep going. And it's interesting to hear them, both groups kind of talk about their processes. And the 2 groups that were partially funded, like the kind of narrative that they have is that, you know, they're kind of focused on building community that will result in a plan. And then that's made the other 2 groups kind of reflect on that too. And I think that's where our partnership with Ford Family is really interesting. They're approaching this from a totally different way. I think they approach it more kind of from what you're talking about. That community building approach is really different than a traditional planning approach. And so we're trying to learn from them about what that means. How do we integrate that into our work? We had a meeting with them, I think, last week, and we're kind of exploring opportunities to learn from, you know, as a state, to learn from them. So I hope you keep asking those questions. I think they're really interesting. They're interesting for me as well. And I don't quite know what the role of the state is in all of that, how we create that, but.
And the conversation that Joe's talking about was the context was the water vision, the 100-year water vision, and the same issue, yeah, same issue. Getting the whole community on board, and it was an interesting conversation. I think there's
Yeah, having the community build a plan instead of the plan build the community, so take it one direct, you know, the community to a plan rather than a plan to a community, I think is a good way to look at it.
Yeah, and then we have this kind of meta community at the state level with the 4 groups, you know, coming together, and, you know, how are we creating that kind of statewide network, support network?
Did you have
A comment. So the plan template talks about in-stream demand, out-of-stream demand, and then later there's language that speaks to groundwater. And I think at all levels, the staff, the commission, and stakeholders I think we need to start formally recognizing that there's aquifer demand. And, you know, there's shallow aquifers associated with the floodplain, and then there's deep aquifers. And I think that does a couple of things for us. One is, we know surface and groundwaters are linked, and what we do to the groundwater can affect surface flows. And we also know that some aquifers are declining, and so there might be, as part of a plan, goals for aquifer recovery or aquifer storage and recovery. So maybe somebody said, we're going to put 100 gallons of water in an aquifer a year, we're going to leave 20 in and take 20 out. But explicitly acknowledging that as a demand sector, I think reflects the growing understanding around surface and groundwater. I also think it relates to community needs, and it would relate very well to the natural infrastructure component of the 100-year vision, should that come to pass. So I just think we need to start explicitly acknowledging that.
In the Harney Basin, we had a solution summit. We put forward all these ideas. I think there were 66 in total for groundwater. Rand will correct me. And one of the ones I put forward was like in situ groundwater protection or groundwater management, and everyone was like, "What is this? In situ? What?" But it's a conversation. Ultimately, we came up with like, how do you protect groundwater in the ground? Is like the idea that everyone's like, "Oh, okay, I get it." But it's a conversation that I don't think we could have had a year ago, and we as a group had a really, really thoughtful conversation about it. I don't know where it's going to go, but it definitely, at least in the Harney group, and I know the Upper Grand Ronde and Lower John Day have been kind of grappling with the groundwater stuff too, especially with the limited information that they have. It definitely is factoring in And I'd be curious if there's some kind of umbrella language that, the in-stream and the groundwater, like, how do you, like, what's the language or what's the term that ties that together in a way that makes sense to people and resonates with people?
I also think that, I'm glad you guys are having those conversations. I also think about the need to protect the kind of the environmental quality of aquifers, because those that we've depleted, we want to recover, or we may recover in the future. And if we're going to put water in them, we want them to be the quality that water is usable by people. So I like the in situ example, and I think it's important for the long-term future of the state.
Chair Reeves, that got really philosophical. Thank you. Do you guys have any specific questions or feedback about your role with the state recognition process, or anything that we can take back and think about with respect to kind of your role? This isn't the only opportunity for you to provide input. We would welcome it really at any time, but we want to make sure that makes sense so that, when it comes before you, like, what it means, what you're doing, and that we give it the weight that it deserves.
I'm actually not sure I do understand what it means, really. I mean, it sounded like it was kind of an optional thing for, there will be a plan, and the groups can decide whether they want to seek commission recognition. And it got me thinking, basically what's the significance in the practical world of recognition or not? And we don't have to address that today. It sounds like there'll be time going forward, but I'm just letting you know it's kind of rattling around in my head.
It might be a good question for the places to weigh in on as well. Like, why would you seek state recognition? Like, what would you hope to gain from that? We've had a lot of conversations in the Learning Partnership about the value of a plan, and I think that a lot of people ask that question and share that interest. I could go on at length, but I think it'd be an interesting thing to talk about with places.
I mean, very practically, if you compare it to the sub-basin plans that OWEB requires, or doesn't necessarily require, but from a funding standpoint, it's a stamp of accreditation.
Okay.
So for future funding and even federal funding, to be able to go to the congressional delegations and say, look, this isn't a standalone thing.
Especially if some are.
Exactly.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah.
Any other questions, feedback, comments at this stage? Sounds like not right now.
All right.
Thank you.
Well, we would like to welcome some representatives from the different places. So from, from Lower John Day, we've got Hannah. You wanna come on up? We'll start kind of exchanging seats. And we've got Leanne from Harney County, the Harney County group. Tim Gross and Adam Denlinger from Midcoast, and Donna Beveridge, Union County Commissioner. And if you guys want to all come up, I think we've got enough seats for everybody. And Steve we got your back. Sorry, it's a little.
Welcome to all of you. Thank you for being here.
Hi, I'm Hannah Fatland. I'm from Condon in the Lower John Day. I'm the outreach coordinator. So for us, we are in step 3. So our first step was building our collaborative process that was completed in 2016. Step 2, characterizing our water resources. We finished that in January of, actually that was not 2017, that was 2019. And so right now we're wrapping up step 3. Today is our last day to send in public comment, and we're hoping to vote on that plan in January. Something we've kind of struggled with is a lack of data when we've been compiling this report. Some gaps we found are in-stream flow. There are very few gauges in the Lower John Day, so additional stream gauges would be really helpful. And same with water temperature data. Not a lot of information available on that, so additional loggers in the tributary basins would be helpful collecting that temperature data. We're kind of working in step 4 also. We've had 3 meetings, trying to come up with strategies. We're finding this to be the most difficult step so far. It's been hard to find common ground and direction and focus. And data gaps are making this difficult. It's hard to come up with solutions for stream flow when we don't know what the state of that is. But we've identified a handful of potential feasibility studies, including the effects of juniper encroachment on the Lower John Day. Step 5, we're hoping to be completed in December 2020. We're feeling pretty good about implementation. We have a focused investment partnership with OWEB, and we're counting on $4 million from that to implement in-stream natural resource strategies in the 30-mile and Butte Creek watersheds. These are both high-priority steelhead streams notified by ODF&W. Some lessons learned. We've had a bit of a difficult time engaging private landowners in the community to participate, and we think mostly this is just because there isn't a perception of a crisis. We've had pretty good participation from the cities and counties, but especially natural resource agencies and agriculture groups and conservation groups. Data gaps are definitely inhibiting the process. We've learned that we've got large ones, and it's hard to come up with solutions when we don't have a grasp on what the problem is. It's just been real time consuming, taking much longer than we thought it would. Technical requirements of step 3 are harder than we thought, and that we need technical people to do this work, so people with a knowledge of GIS and pulling data sets, and takes away a lot of capacity from existing jobs. And also just participation, attrition, and staff turnover. There's a lot of meeting fatigue, and it's taken so long, so some people leave by the time, we're not even done yet. Anyway, yeah. Last thing is what we need to succeed. If we want to make this plan useful, we need to be able to continue, and to continue we need funding. Data gaps, like I've mentioned, not enough gauging stations, no in-stream data, and there's an uncertainty of climate data. And cross-agency participation is shown to be really important in technical assistance, so we'd like to see more participation from ODF&W and DEQ. That's everything. Thank you.
Have they been unwilling to engage with you then, those agencies?
No, I think there isn't someone from ODF&W that's been appointed, given to the Lower John Day, so they just don't have anyone who has the time or there's a position for it to come over, if that makes sense.
So have you overcome any of the struggles with private landowners, or how have you done that, or has that really not been successful, or are these more like ranch? This isn't irrigated, it's more ranch.
Yeah, it's cattle and dryland wheat, mostly. Yeah, we've tried kind of going where they already are, so cattlemen's meetings and Wheat League and the Soil and Water Conservation District annual meetings pull a lot of local landowners, and so just kind of reaching out to them there. And one of our plans moving forward is to host some smaller meetings directed just for landowners, where we invite particular ones, and all of them, and just kind of sit them down and be like, okay, we want your input, we want to know what you need. So we're going to try and make it more smaller, more intimate, and less intimidating, and just let them speak to us. That's kind of a plan we have for step 4, and really getting them engaged.
Did you say you have a survey out now?
Yeah, we do.
And that's like a online survey?
Yep. It's on SurveyMonkey. We just created a website for our place-based planning group, so it's on there. You can, yeah.
So like river measurement, staff gauges, things like that, obviously that's things that, this agency is involved with. Have you had specific plans and sites and looked at our grant programs and things like that to address that, or is it too early in your process to do that?
I think it's a little too early in our process, but I think that's probably what we're going to be just coming up on, actually. Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you.
Morning, I'm Donna Beveridge, Union County Commissioner and the convener for the Upper Ground Round Place-Based. The grant was received before I became commissioner, so that was my surprise when I came in, which is okay. It's been a good process and a learning process. A couple of things that I would say, I'm not going to go through the first 5 because we've been through that a couple of times, but a couple of things that I see as benefits are the learning where other people are coming from on their issues, instead of everyone working in silos, the people that care about fish or the agriculture or the municipal, we all kind of just are out doing our own thing. And I feel this has brought us together, and also with the state agencies, because it's easy for us to just be so judgmental of other people because we're all busy doing our own job. And so I think it's been important for us to have the different state agencies of the group. The tribes have been involved very heavily, and our agriculture's been very heavily involved because we are an irrigated area. And so that's been one of the biggest things that I can see. And we are in step 4. So we have done very well as far as getting along and getting people there. We have an MOU that we put together for people to sign on to, which was in step 1. It took a little while to get everybody on board. I'll give you an example. There was just a little bit of language that the cattlemen and the tribes disagreed on, and we couldn't really move forward until we got them both on board. And so we had a separate meeting with just those 2 entities, and they were able to work out where they were both satisfied with the language, and then we could put that MOU together and move forward. We also tell people, in order to vote for any changes on the MOU, then you need to sign on, so that when we vote on something, like right now, we're starting to get our list of things that we're wanting to implement. Well, you have to be signed on to the MOU for that. Now, some of the state agencies are just there with recommendations. They aren't necessarily voting partners. They don't want to be, but we want them there to help guide us on, and give us suggestions on how we should put things together. Step 4, we came up with about 100 suggestions, narrowed it down to 12. So right now, we're going to be looking through those 12 top and saying, how many issues do they fix? And, figuring out what we want to put at the top according to how many issues they fix. We're not looking at what the costs are going to be right now. We're looking at what, if we have our 4 critical issues, our top 4 that will fix at least 3 of those, maybe 4 of those in some cases. So that's how we're deciding. So we're in that process right now. This is the first time we've had any controversy at all, but we do have ground rules. So our meetings, you have to be respectful, even if you may disagree with their opinion. And so we always read our ground rules at the beginning, and that's worked well for us. I would definitely. We always say we're from Eastern Oregon, so we don't want to go to meetings just to go to meetings. We want to implement something. We don't want to put it on the shelf. So that's very important to our group. And without even looking at my slides, that's kind of an overview of how Union County and the Upper Ground Round is handling it.
Yes.
So, we've talked in this meeting yesterday, I believe it was, a little bit, issues of trust amongst diverse groups is a real challenge to overcome. How do you think this process has helped you to overcome issues that traditionally groups that wouldn't even talk together, let alone come to agreement together. How has this helped you to bridge that gap, do you think? And what would you advise others that were trying to do the same?
I feel like we realize that we're all just people, and people are coming from where they're coming from. They care about what they care about. And, they're not just out to spite their neighbor or spite someone that's, using water for a different issue. And so it's helped us to understand that we're all people. We all care about what we see. But by doing some of our going out and doing tours and different things like that, we're able to see the issues that maybe we couldn't see just sitting in the room together. And so that's been very helpful. And, we don't, maybe we have high expectations that we're going to come out with something, but so far it's went well. And so I feel very confident that we're going to come out with a top 3 or 4 that we will be able to ask for the feasibility study. We're talking to OWEB already on that, and then move on to some kind of implementation. Now, there are some of the ideas that we have that we've been told, that's never going to happen, but we're hoping that, whatever we decide can eventually happen.
Are you aware of the grant programs that WRD has, and have you looked at those, and do you feel confident that you have the information you need to access those to help you?
Yes. In our case, we hired an engineering company that's a lady that's water is her main thing that she knows about, and so she is very active in keeping track of all those grants. And we have pre-meetings ahead of time, and so that we have separate meetings on the side ahead of our big meetings, so that when we get there, we're prepared. But yes, we are aware of all those grants, and I appreciate you asking. Any other questions?
Just one more. When you are at the stage of kind of broadening the plan, broadening to the larger community that you're in, I guess, I'm not sure when that really officially happens, whether it's in the final plans?
Ours started at the very beginning.
You did, so you've been doing that?
Yeah, we've been advertising on the radio. Of course, everybody that comes once is on the email. Another couple of things I was going to say is, in order to vote, you have to have attended 2 of the last 4 meetings. So you can't just sign up and never show up. Mm-hmm. Our farmers, there was sometimes difficult for them to come, and so we would change our meeting time to accommodate them. But we have been doing outreach from the very first day. We didn't decide to do that later. We went from day 1 on the outreach. So,
thank you. Any other questions? All right, thanks very much.
Thank you.
Excuse me.
Good morning.
Morning.
Chair Reeves, Commissioners, thank you for the opportunity to share an update on the Harmony Place-Based Planning Group's work. For the record, my name is Rian Beecraft, and I am the project manager for the Harney Group. And I'll start with the tough news, and then spend a little more time on the better news. So the tough news is that as the USGS and OWRD groundwater study progresses, our knowledge of the groundwater conditions in the basin also progresses. And it's to the point where there's no doubt that the groundwater use in the basin is not sustainable, not for today, not for the future. There are even some areas of the basin where it will likely be very difficult to even reach a new equilibrium. And so the importance of continuing to work closely with the department and working closely with the commission to develop strategies, implementable strategies to help address the conditions and address them over time will be really important. And then also in terms of surface water planning, it's certainly no easier. So already there's not enough surface water in the basin to meet the allocated commitments. And as weather changes over time, the basin's going to need to figure out how to do more with less. So
going into the better news now is that we have this incredible, wise, resilient, committed group that's meeting every single month. And I'll show several pictures to kind of help guide us through the story and the progress of the Harney group. But the things to remember, and if you absorb anything other than this, to me that's bonus. So these are the three most important things. I'll touch on all of them. Trust among the diverse stakeholders is continuing to strengthen. I heard Harmony say earlier that the collaborative is talking about things they would not have been able to talk about 1 year ago, even 6 months ago, and that is not an exaggeration for the sake of different values and contention. So there's been more controversy. And now, and I'll give some examples, the group and the stakeholders will say this at the end of the meeting. Wow, okay, we're really having more open and honest discussion. I never thought of it that way. I always learn something new, and they themselves are like, well, I know we wouldn't have been able to talk about this 6 months ago. So it's one of those things you can't measure, and it's also one of those things that takes so much time. And so the Harney group wasn't up there as one of the plans that will be finished in 2020. We were one of the catalyst groups that started with the community building to then make a plan, and it's showing, fortunately. Also, the collaborative is writing the water plan in real time together, and I'll show you what I mean by that. And then also, implementation is being explored for some of the proposed water strategies already. So really looking at, how could this idea actually work so it's not just sitting on the shelf. And our collaborative, right now, so the collaborative has been meeting regularly for about 3 years, and right now we have 30 to 40 participants at every single meeting, month after month. And we have the, farmers and ranchers, tribal staff and members, environmental conservation groups, rural domestic well users, municipal well users, business owners, scientists. There's Harmony right there in that table. Great picture of me. And in order to help gain a shared understanding of the water conditions in the basin, the collaborative tasked 4 working groups to help collect, compile, and share out information. We have the ecological working group, the agriculture working group, domestic well and municipal working group. In the summer, we contracted with Oregon State University to conduct a mailed questionnaire to the rural domestic well users in the basin to learn more about what they're experiencing with both their water quantity and their water quality. And then this slide may disturb a lot of us in the room. This is what the Vegetation Management Working Group is up to. They talk about things like evapotranspiration. And in terms of that information collection, the step 2, step 3, the collaborative is very, very close to being finished. 2 of the working groups are finished. 2 more are wrapping up. They're so close. Fortunately, and you saw too, the Harney group is working on steps 2, 3, and 4, and maybe a tiny little bit of 5 all at the same time. So fortunately, the collaborative said, well, we have enough information and knowledge in the room that we can get going into the innovative strategies. There's Steve. Harmony mentioned this 2-day water planning summit held in January out in the basin. And again, we had 40 stakeholders attend 2 days back to back to really launch into the step 4 strategies building. And we've had 66 ideas submitted by stakeholders to help address groundwater and surface water issues. And right now the collaborative is focusing on groundwater, like Harmony mentioned, and we'll turn to surface water next year. That gives you a little bit of a sense of our timeline. I won't bore you with the tiny, tiny details of this, but these are the dozens of ideas that were submitted just for groundwater. And so the collaborative organized them into common themes. And so we have these 6 bins, and we have this map. And we're visiting each idea, and we're going through the map, and we're visiting each idea because we wanted to show people that if they wanted to put something on the table, the collaborative would at least consider it. They would at least look at it. And what I mean by look at it is every month we walk into the room, and we have this blank template on the screen. And we pick up one of the ideas, and together as a group, we say, okay, what would the strategy be? If the collaborative really wanted to include this idea in the plan, what's the overarching strategy? What would the objectives and the goals be? And then what are specific recommended actions that can be taken to achieve those goals? And again, you saw that workflow. Maybe you're thinking, God, when are you going to finish this? Again, fortunately, the collaborative has decided that if they're able to reach common ground and reach consensus on some of the recommended actions as they go, no reason to not get started and start exploring how they could actually work on the ground. So one example, I'll give you three, is the Collaborative Reach Consensus to support the Oregon Watershed Enhancement Board in convening an interdisciplinary team to develop a proposal for a voluntary groundwater conservation reserve enhancement program. So a program to help incentivize groundwater irrigators to no longer irrigate for a certain amount of time. And so that interdisciplinary team has indeed been convened. They've met 5 times and are working on that proposal. Another consensus decision reached was, why don't we go ahead and start fundraising to conduct a feasibility study to see how a voluntary groundwater market approach, a voluntary groundwater shares approach, could actually work in the Harney Basin and what kind of results we might see, and then how comfortable stakeholders would be with a program like that. So we just received word last week from Bureau of Reclamation that we've been successful in a grant with them, combined with some funds from our close partner, the Nature Conservancy. A feasibility study will be conducted. And then recently the Collaborative reached consensus and said, why don't we go ahead and start fundraising to see how we can acquire smart meters to have voluntary installation and reporting at least started as soon as possible rather than wait. And good thing that those efforts started to be underway, because very quickly we found there's this kind of this barrier. So it's really good to really try these things out to find where are the blocks. So say we collect all this data from smart meters, and that's great. How are you going to transmit it in a basin that doesn't have cellular data in a lot of areas? So now our team is having phone calls and sending emails around. Likely there will then be fundraising for a feasibility study to figure out how can you actually transmit that data and make use of it. So again, the 3 points: trust among the diverse stakeholders is continuing to strengthen. The Collaborative is writing the water plan in real time and together, and implementation is being explored for some of the proposed water strategies. And we look forward to continuing to give updates and hearing any questions or feedback from you all. Thank you. Thank you.
Questions?
So your group seems to be developed and grown out of crisis rather than out of kind of a different starting point than the others did because of the declining groundwater and the issues you had there. Do you think that's helped you along the process here of cooperation and all that, or has that made it more difficult? Because, I mean, you talked initially about trust, and I've asked about that to some of the other groups. What did you do you think, to make that trust? Why is that growing at the level it's growing? What kind of avenues have you taken to make that possible?
Yeah, Chair Reeves, Commissioner, thank you for the question. What's helped is time, really, and just meeting over and over and over again, and really getting to know each other and having meals together. And I know it sounds too simple, and it probably is, but time is a huge factor. And then also, we just have a really amazing support team for the Collaborative, so we have hired facilitation, and that helps a lot. The other thing, you're right, you know, when there's this type of crisis, it can help bring people to the table, and at the same time, it can keep people away, especially people who maybe feel like there's nothing to worry about for them, because maybe it feels like the law is already on their side. And so they can say, yeah, this is a crisis, but I already know where I stand. And then some people still don't believe it's a crisis. Some people just don't know. And so it's a whole gamut of people who really feel the urgency and people who don't, or maybe people who are not willing to admit it. And so it can still be tough to get some people into the room, and it's something that we just need to keep working at.
Sometimes because of the remoteness of where you're at and everything, because I kind of come from a similar place, you think, well, we're far away from Salem and the state will ignore us or whatever, and it also, we don't want the state involved because, again, lack of trust, and don't want somebody there with a hammer. How has your interaction with OWRD and state agencies been, and is there areas that could be more effective or more helpful to you that you see?
Yeah, thank you again for the question. So for those in the room who, because those questions certainly come up of, well, both. We don't want them in the room, but also how can we have assurance that they're going to work with us?
Right.
So, and some people, depending on their mood that day, you can hear both things from them. But for those who've been attending regularly, and I think even those these days who just come to the first or second meeting, they're kind of like, well, maybe. Because why have they been showing up for 3 years then? And so there's something that's telling them maybe that this can actually be a partnership and maybe something will come of this. Working with the Oregon Water Resources Department, working with Harmony and Justin Iverson has been really, really great so far. I feel really lucky to be working with the personalities that we have as our partners. And we can communicate pretty directly. Frustrations, and hear each other. And so that's been really nice. What could be better is more capacity for the department. Things like working on the Conservation Reserve Enhancement Program. We need OWRD in those conversations and be able to give feedback. And right now they're trying to help us with place-based planning. They're trying to help us with TA requests. They're helping support the learning partnership, things like that. They're helping get more money in the budget. And then we're also like, hey, can you please come give feedback on this? Can you give feedback on our Step 2 and Step 3 drafts? And it's just so much, and there's not enough resources, and there's not enough people for them.
I understand. Thank you.
Thank you.
Other questions?
One quick one. You're coordinating this as a Watershed Council employee?
I'm a consultant. So I'm contracted with the Harney County Watershed Council and the Harney County Court.
Have you seen the council, for example, in its sort of work plan and worldview shift in what it's paying attention to, or what sort of projects are being proposed and implemented? And that's a good question for everybody, actually.
Yeah, thank you for the question. I'm not familiar enough with what the council, kind of their portfolio of projects, but I do know that when I attend their board meetings, they're still talking about a lot of projects I know nothing about. So that means that they're still doing the type of work that they were doing before water planning, but certainly this is a really major focus for them. Yeah.
I could answer that, too.
Yeah.
They're starting to attend. We've asked them to start attending, so they've been doing that. I think it is difficult because they've been, kind of doing their own thing for a while. So, but we've asked them that when we come to the implementation stage, that they're really, the county's not equipped to do that, but they are, and that we want them to be partners in something that we come to consensus to, and they help us move forward with that, because that's what they've been doing, and they know those funding places. But let's make sure that, more people are at the table. So I think there's probably a little apprehension, and I would say, as far as water resources, the people that have come from the state have been very helpful and that kind of thing. One thing I think we're missing is our local person doesn't come very often that works for water resources, so that's disappointing to us. Thank you.
Yes. It goes back to your point, I think, that, what we're finding, councils and others doing restoration work that for a decade plus they've been doing for habitat benefit, they're beginning to learn about the interconnection between stream and floodplain and groundwater. And so I think the goals that they're seeing benefit on things that quite frankly weren't originally goals. And so they're redesigning mentally and on the ground projects, recognizing this suite of goals that go beyond structural complexity for a native salmonid or something like that. I see it as something really good, and I would hope to hear that, oh wow, that connection is being made across the state. So.
I know it's a priority for OWEB now to make sure that people are working together on the water resources for funding and that kind of thing.
What's the timeline for completing the USGS study in the Harney, and what are the reactions to the emergent results, the bad news that you talked about?
Yeah, thank you again for the question, Commissioner. So Harmony will be able to speak to the groundwater study timeline better than I. I believe it's is it the peer review is supposed to be available in October of 2020?
So the study the data collection's done, the analysis are almost done. They're doing report writing now. That will be submitted for peer review early next year, and they expect a published report fall of 2020.
So, and, as you've indicated, there's been, information shared through the advisory committee along the way. And Harmony, I don't know how you felt, but at the October Groundwater Study Advisory Committee, there was a real felt, at least for me, in my personal experience, shift and really understanding for those who were there, that for a lot of people, the results are showing a more dire situation than they were originally anticipating, certainly more than they were hoping for. And so now, how are people responding to that? I think people are processing it and absorbing it. And then we held a meeting again in November, a collaborative meeting, and those people who were in the room for that, they showed up and they were still, thinking, okay, so what are we going to do with this? And so, some people have more questions about the data and the methodology, and they'll say, okay, I'll take what you're saying, but I still, I'm not sure I agree with X, Y, and Z, little things like that. So, of course, everyone responds to it differently, and yet, people are still coming to the table trying to figure out what to do.
But so it's not been a bunch of kind of denial of, kind of not accepting the information.
Yeah, I just heard Harmony say that's there too. I don't know if was there something else you were going to say?
I was just going to say, with the people who have been with us for 3 years, I think the last meeting was really good. I'd say that in talking to people, Karen from Watershed Council said on her drive home she just was really sad. There's a heaviness to that, and also, but a hopefulness I think that comes to. And I think there is, for some people, some grieving that needs to occur. It's really, I think, very, you have to acknowledge that it's a really hard reality.
Yeah, and in terms of the denial or not accepting the results, there will be that. And I think, as Harmony said, the people who are coming to the advisory committee meetings and also, or the collaborative meetings, it's different than people who haven't been following. It's just different. And so there's so much conversation of how do you get this information out to the community, and even before fall. And that's hard because the results of the study won't be considered final. And so you're still talking about preliminary information, but it's pretty good. It's pretty comprehensive. And so how do you start helping the broader community really understand? And there's a lot of conversations going on around that. Thank you.
Thank you. Next up.
Good morning. I'm Tim Gross with the City of Newport. I'm one of the co-conveners with the Mid-Coast Water Planning Partnership on the Central Oregon Coast. Thank you for the opportunity to chat with you a little bit this morning. I'd like to talk about just three things, really. What's been working well for us, what's not been working so well for us, and then some thoughts on the adoption or recognition of the plan by the Commission. The place-based planning process has really created a forum for thoughtful discussion around water in the Central Oregon Coast. People are very, very busy, as you can well imagine, and this is a forum for busy people to talk about something that's very, very important, and that's water. And before we started this planning process, there was a lot of organizations and groups doing their thing without really communicating or talking with each other. And it has taken us quite some time, and you've heard this with some of the other conveners, to develop trust within our group. And the process by which we created our charter and then began meeting and working through these water issues has developed relationships and open communication amongst stakeholders that never took place before.
And now you see water supply and, environmental natural resources and our private industrial commercial users beginning to work and communicate together, and I think I'm getting feedback. Is that better? I think I was pointing at you.
I'm sorry. You're not facing directly, I'm not hearing you. Thank you.
Is that better? That said, what hasn't worked super well is that this process requires constant investment of time and resources. And so we have very, very busy people who have to be regularly engaged on an ongoing basis, and funds invested in this process for it to be of value, because our partners that participate and are willing to participate are there because they recognize the value for their organization, be it a water supplier or industry or for natural resources. And we struggled because the model that we chose when we started was a consultant-driven model, and we didn't have enough resources to continue in that model. And so we got to this point where we're no longer able to engage our consultants on a regular basis, and we had really a lack of dedicated support for almost a year. And so it was a real struggle for us to advance our planning process, continue to get our partners to engage at a significant level where they recognized value in their investment and time in that process. And so we shifted our model and have recently engaged a planning coordinator that we contract with directly outside of a consultant to help us continue to invest the time necessary to make value in our planning process. That was a lesson learned, I think, and I think it's important for it's an important lesson learned for future planning processes to consider, is that you may have to make sure that the model that you choose is sustainable financially through the duration of your planning process. So our planning process was funded 1/3 through the state, 1/3 through the city of Newport when we began, and now is funded 1/3 through our partners and other private grants. And I think that's an interesting model because it's a third now. It was 50-50 state and Newport when we began. But as we have gotten through the years of our planning process, because our partners have recognized the value of the planning process, they begin to invest financially in the process as well. And so I think that from a funding seed perspective is that if you could have a model where you have a partner and the state working together and are able to prove value in that planning process, you'll begin to see investment locally in the planning process, and they'll be able to advance that. Some thoughts on adoption of the plan by the state, or recognition. I'm not sure what it's actually going to be. Water Resources has always been a very close partner with the Midcoast in this planning process, and so it's weird to me for Water Resources to even be recognizing a plan that they were vital in actually implementing and beginning and developing. And it's more the other state agencies and what their thoughts are and how they're going to consider this planning process. We've been actively working with DEQ and OHA, Department of Forestry, ODF&W, all the letters, right? Department of State Lands. And how are they going to respond to this plan when we are looking at the implementation of these strategies that we're proposing? And that's a bit of a rhetorical question, because the way they respond to that plan is going to be directly impacted by how we approach them in the implementation. And I think one of the most valuable things we've gotten out of the water planning process is how to plan and work together to implement these strategies. That charter and how we work and play around water is going to influence how we work with these agencies in the implementation of this plan. And so one of the strategies we need to consider as we're moving forward is the process by which we implement this plan, and how we go about doing that, how we work and play around implementation. And when it comes to adoption and recognition of the plan, it's going to be, I think, it's going to be influenced by that strategy, by the strategy of how we're doing the implementation. So that's important, I think. An important consideration in planning step 5 is that you're not going to be able to have this document with a strategy that you're going to hand to a state agency and say, this is what we're going to do. That's only just the beginning point, is that this is what we're shooting toward. And how do we get from point A to point B? Because the planning process was all about how to get from point A to point B. We started a journey with no destination.
which is very, very interesting, because the journey is really about how we did the journey. Once we get to our strategies, then we actually have our destinations, and only then do we really have a place that we're shooting for. We've been working for years without having any idea where we're going, and that's really interesting to get people to engage with you in that, because they recognize that, yeah, we might not have any idea where we're going, but we like the way we're doing it, and we recognize the value that when we actually do figure out where we're going, we're going to have a good, solid process in place to get there. And, this is a pilot study, I understand that, but some of those sort of philosophical components of how you get people to work together is important. We've heard this through all the conveners. It's the process of getting together, of breaking bread together, of building trust, and only then will these really busy and important people who have a million things going on in their day, will they invest the time in water in their community, in the partners they're working with on a day-to-day level, the people that were normally the people they would compete for water. Now they're their partners with them to be able to advance their water future in their region together. And it's important enough for them to invest that time. So thank you very much for the opportunity to speak. I'm going to actually hand the mic over to Adam Denlinger, one of our partners, and he's going to continue.
Thank you.
Thank you. Madam Chair, members of the Commission, my name is Adam Denlinger. I'm the General Manager of Silver Rock Water District. I am also a co-convener of the Mid-Coast Water Planning Partnership. I hope I underscore a few things that Tim has talked about with our process, and yes, we began the process of planning, and we were consultant-led, and realized that was not going to be a sustainable approach for the partnership, simply because we didn't have the resources to support consultants. And so we did have a period where we were kind of slow in moving the process forward, but I'm happy to say that we had a very engaged group of people. We were concerned that we might lose some of those folks, but I'm happy to say we haven't. And I think that's because there's a lot of passion in the Mid-Coast centered around water. Recently, in our process, we did hire a water planning coordinator. She's with us in the room today. I'd like to recognize her. Her name is Alexandria Scott. She came on just a few months ago, and she's doing a fantastic job of gearing up our partnership for the conclusion of ending Step 3. And I commend her for her work so far. I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the lessons we've learned as a partnership. And I don't think it's overselling it to say that our greatest success so far is the relationships that we've been able to build. This topic of water is a difficult topic to discuss with some people, let alone get in a room and start to plan on how to use that water. And I think that as a municipal water provider working in municipal government in water and wastewater for well over 30 years now, I have to look at this process and say that we probably haven't done an effective job as a municipal agency at messaging around the value of water. And when you think about it, water providers provide water to communities at a tremendous value. I mean, we do. So we've built onto this value-centered model from our communities that water is always going to be there at the tap when I turn it on. I tell this story from time to time because it happens all the time. And it happened to me again the other day when I pulled through a unnamed coffee shop to grab a cup of coffee, and the lady there asked me, she noticed the logo on the side of my vehicle. She said, "Wow, you work for Silver Rock Water District." And I said, "Yeah, where's that at?" And wow, and wow, I didn't know that was there. You guys provide water? And I said, "Yeah." I said, "Well, do you know where your water comes from?" "Yeah, it comes from the tap, silly." And I'm thinking to myself, we're not doing a good enough job at messaging our communities about the value of water. But I think something that I've learned through just the few technical conversations I've had on the governor's 100-year water vision is that is going to be a big part of that process, is how we message our communities about the value of water. Let's face it, that at the heart of daily life is water. We all need it. We only have so much of it. The environment is not making water for us. So I think that getting into a room, just like we have been able to do in the Mid-Coast, and discuss how we plan for the future use of water has become a great value to all of us. And so I do want to highlight one thing, well, maybe two things. Commissioner Moll, I had the pleasure of sitting across from you at our last partnership meeting, and we actually talked a little bit about this messaging, so I'm not surprised to hear you bring it up here. We need to do a better job at that. That's really a challenge and a focus of our partnership as well. The value with regard to the planning document, to me as a water provider, as a water manager, will also allow districts like ours, cities in rural communities to better position themselves for funding. One of the things that one of the other hats I wear is as a board member of Special Districts Association of Oregon. So I represent water districts and small districts across the state of Oregon. And one of the struggles we see with these smaller communities is the availability of funding for their improvements. These are small communities that have relatively little resources that they're trying to stretch as far as they can. This kind of planning will help to provide these communities an opportunity to leverage funding that requires qualification for being in a regional planning process. So I think there's a lot of value in planning, not just at the local level, understanding that place-based planning helps to unite a community around a central theme, but it will also allow those communities to position themselves to more competitively be able to seek funding. I thank you for your time, of course, this morning, and your interest. I do want to thank Director Byler and his team for their support of the Mid-Coast Water Planning Partnership. They have been very generous and kind, especially with the repeated number of emails and questions we've had of them, and we certainly do appreciate their work here as well. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Any questions from commissioners? Yes, Bob.
It's not so much a question, but it's us taking notes, and this is a very positive and impressive presentation, so I thank you for that. And what I want to do is just walk real quickly through my notes and make sure I heard your points, and then ask a simple question. So what I heard is time's important. We should be looking at this as a long-term investment, and we really need to give it time to have a solid foundation. Another thing I heard was support, heard money for a facilitator and coordination so that you had the staff necessary to keep the energy alive in the programs. You needed a local investment and a champion on the local level. You needed state agency involvement in parallel with all the local efforts. I heard it was complex and you needed multiple and different strategies to bring in the various stakeholders. And I understand that varies from site to site depending on condition and condition. Tim, I really struggle a little bit with the note I had on you, that you made, is that the journey is a process itself, and that's important. You may not know the goal to begin with, but the journey that allows you to build up your team and build up that trust is important, even if you're uncertain of what your goal will be defined as. And that's kind of this organic relationship building, and you need those relationships before you really can start to wrestle with the difficult issues. And overall, we really need to communicate the value of water. I think it's hilarious that, where does your water come from? It comes out of the tap. And the one thing I heard as a recommendation was to leverage funding as part of the planning process so that we can encourage people to be in the planning process. And that leads me to the question I had, and that's from your perspective, what can we as a commission do to be helping support the place-based planning?
If I may, I appreciate when the commission members come to some of our place-based planning events, and a one-off visit to a meeting certainly has value, but I would imagine each of you are from a region where that planning process is taking place at some level, and I would actually encourage you to be active participants in that, because I think you begin to see at a little better level some of the things that we go through trying to coordinate and organize people around water. And I appreciate your comments. I think you hit it really very well. Some of the things that I don't even think I heard was one of the things you mentioned was a local champion. It's incredibly important to have a local champion, and sometimes it doesn't necessarily have to be the same champion all the time. I certainly started out in a very visible level in the beginning of the planning partnership when we started, and because of other obligations I've had to back off, and we brought other co-conveners on, and they've done an excellent job of standing up and representing our region. But it's really important that you have that individual do that. And so I would think that if you took some of the notes that you took and you think about those as you hopefully advance the next round of place-based planning, is that we can provide guidance to those groups so they can start out on a better foot. So they're not making the mistakes that we did, because, it doesn't really matter what we were planning around when we started. It was developing relationships and how to work and play well together. And we spent a long time building trust. And you could be talking about water or any other topic, getting us through that process to the point where you can have meaningful conversations. Every one of us went through that process. And every group after us is going to have to go through that process. And helping us get a firm foundation and a firm footing in that role or in that place, that would be really very helpful.
I would add, I appreciate the question, and I think what I would add to that is that everywhere I go, on behalf of the district, on behalf of the partnership, on behalf of SDAO, I bring up the topic of water planning, and this effort that is being funded by OWD. I anticipate that just from the conversations I have after these presentations, it's not just me, Tim and others from our group around the state, I anticipate that OWD is going to then begin to receive requests for funding or for opportunities to participate in place-based planning in their communities. Just what little exposure we've had with the 100-year water vision, you can see that there's a great interest in our state in how we manage water for future generations, future 100 years, for example. I'm not sure that Director Byler is going to have the resources that he's going to need to support those kind of demands in the future. I agree with Tim, but I would also like to say that while Director Bauer has a tremendous amount of staff, Harmony and Steve do a great job in the pilot programs, but in the future, I just really believe that more resources are going to need to be placed with the department to support this effort, because if we're going to be serious at the legislative level with how we manage water in this state, I anticipate that that's going to have a cascade effect on this department and how it responds to the communities that want to go through this process as well. Thank you.
Yes, please. Agreed. Thank you so much for the question. For me, I just want to say, please keep doing what you're doing. So being here today and hearing your words of encouragement and saying, I'm excited and I'm impressed and this looks great and we can't wait to see the plans. And I can't tell you, there's a sense of relief that washes over when I hear that, because often you're like, you're wondering, are we going to be asked to try to do 15 other things or try to do things, can you also make sure to do all of these things? And to hear both the recognition of the need to build community and have that community buy-in and build that trust. A lot of people don't understand that and are only looking at the timeline and when is it going to be done and when is it going to be done and when is it going to be done and how is it going to be implemented. And to hear both, to hear from commissioners that they really respect and recognize the value of that community building and taking the time, but hey, we're doing this, we want this to have impact. Hearing both of those things is really wonderful. So agreed, would so love to have you attend our meetings, and also just please keep doing and sharing what you already are. Thank you.
Thank you.
I had a comment about that too. After step 5, some of you are getting close to step 5. Do you think you can sustain and keep this going on after that? Because really that's, again, a plan on a shelf will be nice for the museum someday if you don't do anything with it. So without funding, if the place-based planning funding dries up, or not dries up, but you've reached the end of the goal, so that's the end of it, now we're going to go find somebody else. Do you anticipate keeping these coalitions and this trust and all the things that you've worked so hard to build? How do you anticipate keeping that going afterwards, or what's your vision of that, or have you even thought that far ahead yet?
In the upper ground round, we have thought ahead, and we do plan to continue with no and, because water is important, and so that's why we're looking at funding now. We've stayed pretty much within our budget for this up to step 5, but we're already planning to go past that. We know we're going to need money, and so we want to continue, and we want everybody at the table in those meetings. So that's where our local, irrigation district and soil and water come in to kind of help provide that continuation. But it is a goal, and the one thing that we didn't mention that we all have realized is each one of us are so different. Just in the 4 pilots, the needs, the strategies, everything is so different. So what we appreciate from the state is that you're not painting us all with the same brush, because it's easy to be down here and just make the same rule all the way across Oregon. And by having the place-based, we're able to identify what's important in our area or what the needs are in our area. So to come back with that, that's something that we really appreciate from Water Resources. And we do have people chomping at the bit to start this process. There are many other counties that are wanting to do that, so.
If I may, it's a very good question, and I don't anticipate that this kind of investment is going to go away once a plan is completed. I think for the Midcoast Water Plan Partnership, one of the greatest outcomes that we have right now, other than the relationships that we're developing, is the collaboration that is being recognized. Just recently, through collaboration of the water providers in our region, we developed for the first time a water conservation consortium. We've contributed funds to that process. We've hired a consultant, and that will be an ongoing annual process to educate our community about the value of water and how they can use that water in a more sustainable way so that it can be available for the environment and for future generations. So I really don't see this as a risk of something that ends just because we adopt a plan. I see this as something that will continue on for generations to come. Thank you so much.
I just want to thank all of you again for making the trip over here. It's really wonderful for us to hear from you directly, and I hope you can feel we are all in on this on this place-based planning. So I hope you can feel the enthusiasm that we feel for this, and encourage you to keep up the great work. Thank you. So we have one more agenda item, which is public comment. I have only one request for public comment. So if there are others, please fill out one of these yellow slips and give them to Nirvana at the end of the table. But this one is from Anna Rankin from the Pudding River Watershed Council. On agenda item K. I want to just say again, I know I've said it already, but just to be really clear, this is on the East Valley Water District agenda item, and that record is closed, so these comments are not part of the commission's decision or part of that record. They are separate from that. Thank you. Welcome.
I understand. Thank you, Commissioners. Again, my name's Anna Rankin. I'm the Director for the Pudding River Watershed Council. I'm here to thank you on behalf of the watershed and its council. At this point, have been working for about 6 years in this area. Ron Garst, Tom Murtaugh, and I sat around a table about 6 years ago and talked about the different impacts in the Pudding River watershed and threats, and Drift Creek was at the top of the list. Again, the gratitude at this point to express, I recognize that place-based planning is very important, and the plan as it was presented was divisive. And as a community, having the plan farmer versus farmer, we again as a council took a position against it. So here, nothing more than thank you for following the advice of the subcommittee at this point in time. Very briefly, one of the areas where we had to recognize, where do we meet people? How do we know where people are at? How do we contact people? And one of the things I haven't heard here is just the ecumenical societies, faith-based societies. I have taught myself how to knit, and so I can go to a prayer shawl meeting and have a conversation with ladies that are landowners, and they have a really interesting way of communicating with their communities about water or about threats or about the ecology in their system that maybe would never have happened before. So not an Agenda J, but definitely from a watershed council point of view. How do you meet people where they're at? You have to do things a little out of the box. All right, thanks so much.
Thank you. I believe that is the conclusion of our agenda, and we're adjourned. Thank you.